On February 15th, 2004, two police officers drove down a quiet street in a little English village called Murrow, and they pulled over in front of this little brick bungalow. Earlier that day, a neighbor who lived on this street had called the police to report hearing a strange digging sound coming from inside of this bungalow. And so these officers had been sent out to see what the sound was and make sure the occupants of this home were okay. Now, these two officers were not particularly worried about the occupants of this house. They assumed that some wild animal must have snuck in while the owners were away, and that was all this was. But, as they would quickly learn, that was not the case. After climbing out of their car, the two officers just stopped and listened for a second to see if they could hear this digging sound, but the bungalow was quiet, the street was quiet, and so the two officers shut their car doors and made their way up to the front porch of this bungalow and knocked on the front door. After a few moments, when nobody answered, one of the officers reached down and tried the handle and found it was unlocked. And so he opened the door just a crack and he called out through this opening in the door into the bungalow saying, "Hey, it's police, we're here to check on you." But when no one called back to them, the officer opened the door the rest of the way, and immediately both officers saw there was a huge problem inside of this house. The entire first floor was flooded with several inches of water, and they could hear from somewhere in the back of the property the sound of running water. And so again, both officers called out into this house to try to get the attention of anyone who might be inside, and when again they were met with silence, the officers walked into the flooded house and began walking straight back towards this running water sound. And eventually, after walking through the living room, they entered this hallway that went right to the back of the property, and as soon as they were in it, they could see there was an open door at the end of the hallway on the left, and it seemed like the running water sound was coming out of that room. And so the two officers, one by one, sloshed down this hallway to this room. They turned left, looked inside, and what they saw completely shocked them and immediately sprung them into action. 2 months before these officers came to this bungalow and found it flooded with water, the owner of this bungalow, 51-year-old Ronald McClagish, had broken up with his girlfriend. And this breakup was really hard on Ronald. He was already divorced, he was totally broke, he had loads of health issues like bad asthma, he had some liver issues, and just generally he was someone who was kind of physically frail. And so this girlfriend had been one of the very few good things in his life, and now she was gone and he was alone again. And so very quickly after this breakup, Ronald fell into a very dark depression. And so for 6 weeks after they broke up, Ronald, for the most part, just stayed in bed and kind of moped around his bungalow, kind of feeling bad for himself. But then finally, at the end of those first 6 weeks after the breakup, Ronald decided he wanted to get his life back together and just move on. So on February 1st, 2004, so roughly 2 weeks before those two officers would come to his bungalow because of this digging sound, Ronald would wake up feeling determined to start anew. And the first thing he was going to do was purge his bungalow of anything that was his ex-girlfriend's. She left a lot of things behind when they broke up. She had not collected them. And so now they were just kind of sources of pain. And where most of her stuff was inside of Ronald's bungalow was in this closet in one of the bedrooms at the end of the hall. So that morning, Ronald headed down the hall. He turned left into the bedroom. He opened up the closet. He went inside, and with a trash bag in hand, he began rifling through everything in this closet, and anything that was hers, he would take it and put it right into the trash bag. And at some point, when Ronald was almost done pulling the last few things of his girlfriend's out and into the trash bag, from behind him, he heard this strange sound coming from the bedroom. It sounded like wood bending or creaking, but before he could turn around to see what the sound was, the door to the closet he was in slammed shut with incredible force, and suddenly Ronald was trapped inside of this closet in total darkness. Now, Ronald was likely shocked at first, but he would have reached and tried for the handle and found that no matter what he did, he could not open this closet again. And so Ronald Ronald began screaming for help and pounding on the door, but nobody came to help him. The closet that Ronald was in was fairly tall, but it was only 2 feet wide by about 2 feet deep, which meant Ronald could only stand inside of this closet. He couldn't sit down, he couldn't bend down, he literally was trapped standing. And Ronald didn't have water, he didn't have food, he knew that no one was going to be checking on him anytime soon, and even though his bungalow was kind of small and shabby, it was built out of brick. And so the likelihood that his calls for help were penetrating outside loud enough that people could hear them and that they would come in and rescue him was pretty slim. And so at some point that evening, Ronald realized he needed to do something different if he was going to get out of this closet. And so above him were a series of pipes across the ceiling. And so he reached up and he grabbed one of them and he broke it off. He was likely thinking that with this pipe, maybe he can burrow a hole in the wall and crawl through to another room, or maybe he can punch a hole in the door and somehow unlock it, or at a minimum, with the metal pipe, smashing it against the wall or the door would be louder than any noise he could make by yelling. However, the second he broke that pipe off the ceiling, something horrible happened. The pipe he broke was a water pipe. And as soon as it was broken, icy cold water began pouring down directly on top of Ronald's head and face. And again, because he can only stand basically in the middle of this closet, he couldn't get out of the way of this water. It was like he was under a waterfall and couldn't go anywhere. And so he likely tried to ignore the water and tried to use the pipe and screamed and do anything he could to get someone to know he was in here, but no one could hear him. And so it was like he was being tortured with this freezing water, and he's in this tight claustrophobic space. It's total darkness and he's totally panicking. And for days and days, that would be Ronald's nightmarish reality. But despite how terrible his circumstances were, Ronald continued to use that pipe to both smash the walls to make loud sounds. He also began burrowing into the walls, trying to make a hole. But Ronald was getting weaker and weaker. He became very sick. And also, because the water was constantly hitting his head and face, his skin got so saturated that literally his skin started falling off. It basically opened up into these sores and began to sag, and the water just began brushing his skin off. And so finally, after about a week of being trapped in this closet in these terrible conditions, Ronald realized help was not going to come in time, and so he put his pipe down, he kind of slumped up against the wall, and then closed his eyes. Ronald's neighbor, who called the police, actually did hear Ronald using that pipe to try to dig a hole in his wall, and she heard Ronald smashing the pipe on his door, and she must have heard muffled shrieks and yells, but she didn't know what they were and kind of just decided it wasn't her business. But when Ronald's house went from all these strange sounds to silence, that was when she called the police and said, "Hey, I had heard some digging sounds coming from the bungalow, and now I don't." And so when those 2 police officers arrived at Ronald's bungalow, they went inside, they went down the hallway, they went into the bedroom where Ronald had gone, and they saw this huge wardrobe, which is a big wooden piece of furniture, toppled over right in front of the closet. And at the bottom of the closet, they saw 2 human feet protruding from underneath that little space at the bottom of the closet. Those feet belonged to Ronald. He had managed to force his feet underneath the closet, but of course, he could not have fit underneath the closet door. And so the 2 police officers rushed over, and together they barely were able to get this wardrobe off of the closet door. And when they opened the door up, Ronald was in there, he was deceased, his body was still in a standing position, kind of rigid and propped up against the wall, and freezing water was still pouring down onto his head. It would turn out no one had intentionally trapped Ronald. Instead, his wardrobe was just unstable, and it happened to topple over at the worst possible moment. On Thanksgiving morning in 1900, an 18-year-old named Thomas Pedler told his mother that he was going out for a bit, but he'd be back in time for turkey that afternoon, and then he grabbed his jacket and his coat and he headed out the door. Thomas lived in a very working-class neighborhood in San Francisco, California, where, generally speaking, nothing big really ever happened. It was kind of a place where people just worked, and that was it. But on this day, something huge was happening in Thomas's neighborhood. The big football game between Stanford University and the University of California was taking place at the stadium in Thomas's district, and they were expecting over 20,000 people to cram into this stadium. And so Thomas was not about to miss this incredible spectacle, even though he didn't have enough money to buy a ticket. But he knew he would find a way to watch this game. And so Thomas leaves his house and he runs to the stadium, which was not far from his house, and he waited in front of the front gate where all these people are streaming in to go into the stadium. And around 11 a.m., Thomas's very close friend, Charles, who was also a young man, made his way to the front gate. The two met up, and at first, their plan was to try to sneak in with the horde of people that were making their way into the stadium. But even though they were still hours away from the opening kickoff of this big game, it was at 2:30 p.m., the stadium was packed. I mean, there was nowhere to sit, there was nowhere to stand. People that had tickets who were going in are looking around thinking, where are we going to watch this game? And so Thomas and Charles are kind of like, well, what's the point of sneaking in if there's nowhere to watch? And so they decided, okay, we need to find another way to watch this game. And so they began looking around, and they noticed there was a huge fence that lined the perimeter of this stadium. And they saw there was some people kind of climbed up on this fence trying to get a view down onto the field. And pretty quickly, when Thomas and Charles decided they would try to do that too, they saw that all the good spots on this fence were already taken. The spots that were open provided no view onto the field. And so that option as well didn't work. And so Thomas and Charles are frustrated. They're starting to worry that they will not see this big game. But when they walked back over to the front gates of the stadium, they happened to notice across the street was this group of people rushing over to this big white brick factory building. And they were literally placing ladders up against the sides of this building and beginning to climb up it. I mean, this is a 5-story building, and they are just basically free climbing the windows and the fire escapes. And Thomas and Charles realized that the top of this factory was flat and provided a perfect view down onto the field. And so all these people, they're trying to get a good seat to watch this game. And so without any hesitation, Thomas and Charles decide they're going to do that too. So they left the stadium, they ran across the street, and they began climbing up the ladders and climbing the windows and the fire escapes until finally they made it onto the roof, 55 feet off the ground. And when they got up there, there wasn't that many people. And so Thomas and Charles were able to run right over to the front edge of this building and claim a spot with an absolutely perfect view of the game. A couple of hours later, at 2:30 p.m., when the game actually started, the rooftop that Thomas and Charles were on was now completely packed with people. Hundreds of people have climbed up onto this factory. There were some factory workers down below telling people, do not do this. Do not climb on top of this factory. It's not safe. But nobody listened to them, and the police either didn't notice this was happening or they didn't care. And so there's all these people that are on this roof. They're all super excited, and the game has begun. It's 2:30, and as soon as the game started, it was like the crowd in the stadium, which could be heard very easily from this rooftop, just kind of erupted, and there were all these bands playing in the stadium. I mean, it was chaos down below, and it really caught on the roof. All these guys, including Thomas and Charles, they're getting amped about this game. They're singing, they're chanting, they're screaming, they're yelling. I mean, it's total chaos. And Thomas and Charles loved it. But about 20 minutes into the game, as Thomas and Charles are enjoying themselves and the crowd is still going wild, a dull cracking sound could be heard coming from one side of this roof. And so Thomas and Charles, they kind of spun around to see where this cracking sound had come from. And when they began looking out across the sea of people, they noticed on the far side of the roof where the sound had kind of come from, they could see people scrambling to get off the roof. But before Thomas and Charles and the other people around them who were watching this happening could figure out what was going on, there was a much louder cracking sound, and suddenly the floor underneath Thomas, Charles, and everybody else collapsed. And immediately, people on this roof fell all the way to the bottom of this factory, 55 feet below. There weren't loads of floors inside of this factory. Instead, it was basically just one big building, 55 feet high, that housed this brick structure right in the center of the factory that was almost as tall as the entire factory. It was almost like the factory was a shell around this brick smaller structure right in the middle that was like 40 feet tall. And so after the ceiling collapses, Thomas, he falls, but miraculously, he lands on a wooden beam that stretched across the entire factory, like a support beam, and he grabbed onto it, saving himself from falling all the way down. And so Thomas, he only fell maybe 5 feet, so he was okay, but he didn't have a great grip on this beam. He was holding on, but just barely. And so Thomas, he turns and he's looking around at what's happened below him, and he's hearing people screaming, and he's hearing the sounds of people running around trying to help those who have hit the ground on the bottom. And Thomas immediately begins scanning for Charles, and he finds him. Charles was one of the other fairly lucky people, at least in Thomas's mind, Charles seemed lucky, because instead of falling from the roof all the way to the ground, Charles and 15 or 20 other people had fallen right onto that brick structure that kind of made up the main part of this factory. And so Charles had only fallen maybe 10 or 15 feet onto this structure. And so Thomas is thinking, oh, Charles and these other people, they've survived this fall, they're okay. However, the second Charles and the others, who supposedly were saved by landing on this brick structure, the second they hit that brick structure, despite not suffering catastrophic injuries like broken bones and horrible internal injuries, these people on the brick structure began letting out these primal screams, these just horrible blood-curdling screams. And as they did, these loud popping sounds began coming out of their body, and then their bodies began contorting forward, almost like a bug rolling up onto itself. It would turn out this factory was not a normal factory. This was a glass factory, and in order to make glass, you need to heat sand and some other chemicals up to extraordinarily high temperatures. You need a furnace that can literally burn hotter than lava. And so that brick structure that was housed in the middle of this 5-story tall factory was a glass furnace, and it was on. And so even though the inside of this furnace was the hottest place, it was over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, the outside of this furnace, where Charles and the others had landed, believing they were saved from this 55-foot fall to their death, was still extremely hot. So hot that the factory workers couldn't even go near the furnace, even with special equipment on. The way they worked with this furnace was with these long metal pokers. They would work the flames and the glass at a distance. And so the instant that Charles and the others landed on the top of this furnace, they began to light on fire. Those snapping sounds that were coming out of their bodies was the sound of them instantly igniting on fire. And so Thomas and the others who had initially survived this horrible collapse watched as Charles and the others shrieked and shrieked, and their bodies continued to contort, and they continued to burn and smolder. And Charles actually, he would roll up so tightly that his body began to roll down the curved side of this furnace, and at some point his body slipped into a crack in the furnace, and he actually fell into the flames inside, at which point he went silent. Around the time that Charles and the others stopped shrieking, a number of people just out on the road heard the commotion, and they came inside, and one of them was Thomas's father. And in a terrible twist of fate, he actually looked up and saw his son clinging to the beam, Thomas, except it was so hot inside of this factory that Thomas was sweating, he was losing his grip, it was really hard to hold on to this beam, and his father watched as Thomas lost his grip and fell the 10 more feet down onto the furnace exterior. He landed feet first, then he fell onto his stomach and his face. He immediately ignited on fire, began shrieking, and then went silent. All told, 23 people would be killed during this roof collapse, and dozens more would be horribly injured and disfigured. This collapse goes down as one of the very worst disasters in sports history. However, on this day, the crowd inside the stadium stadium was so caught up in the game that they actually didn't notice this horrible tragedy taking place just 100 feet away from where they were. It wasn't until the end of the game, when the winning team's fans carried their players in this kind of spontaneous parade out of the stadium to celebrate, that they walked out onto the street and saw all these burnt up, rolled up corpses of the people who had landed on the furnace. In April of 1979, a 69-year-old woman named Monica Myers was appointed mayor of a little village called Betterton in the U.S. state of Maryland. Betterton used to be this very fancy resort town on the water where people from Baltimore and Philadelphia would come there for vacations. They had fancy hotels and restaurants and shops. But by the time Monica became Betterton's mayor, Betterton had kind of gone downhill. People had stopped coming to Betterton, all the hotels shut down or were abandoned or burned down. The summer homes of the rich people from the big cities, those got sold off. And down at the beach, all these glamorous boardwalks literally just kind of crumbled into the sea, and in their place were all these shanty towns where homeless people set up their camps. But Monica had grown up in Betterton, and so she really loved the town and wanted to improve it. And so when she became mayor in 1979, she really leaned into her new role way more than other mayors would. Instead of managing the village from an office, like most mayors would do, Monica literally went out in town and just began doing lots of jobs around the town for free. She would ride around with the police and literally stop crimes in action. One time, she stumbled across someone looting a vacant hotel, and she personally got out, chased this person down, and made them put everything back that they had taken. She would pick up trash on the beach, she would do random repairs on people's homes and businesses all over town, and sometimes she would just go door to door asking people how they were doing. And so very quickly, the people of Betterton really grew to love Monica, and they loved seeing her every single day just out and about making Betterton a better place. And so on March 20th, 1980, roughly 1 year into Monica's tenure as mayor, it was immediately noticeable to the people of Betterton when Monica was nowhere to be seen. That day, she did not go to the police station in the morning like she normally did. She was not seen at the beach doing her trash pickup, and she didn't knock on anybody's door. And so by mid-morning that day, the people of Betterton, all 120 of them, were basically out in force looking for Monica. And at 11:30 a.m., the police in Betterton got a call about Monica. It was this guy who was totally panicked. He could barely make a sentence, and he basically just told the police, "You gotta get here now." And so the police hopped in their cars and they sped to the address this guy gave them. And when they got there, they saw it was this very plain, boxy building that was kind of tucked back in the woods. It was far away from the town center, and really nobody ever went over here. And the police, when they parked their cars, they saw the guy who had called the police, the distraught caller, was standing outside of the front door. He was obviously crying, and he was waving for them to come over and follow him into this building. And so the police got out of their cars, they ran over to this guy, and they're asking him, what happened? Where's Monica? What's going on? But this guy was so hysterical, he really could not describe what happened to Monica. He just kept telling them to come on, follow me. And so he led them into this building, and pretty quickly they entered this huge warehouse where all across the ceiling were these big metal catwalk areas that kind of zigged and zagged all over this warehouse, and below them, all over the floor, were these huge industrial-sized 15-foot tall vats that contained something. And so this guy who had led police here, he stops and he just points at the nearest vat. And so the police, picking up his cue, begin walking towards this vat. And as they got closer and closer, they were hit with this horrible smell that made them gag and cough. And before long, they had to stop and kind of compose themselves. The smell was so bad. It would turn out this building that was kind of removed from the town center of Betterton was Betterton's sewage treatment plant. And that morning, Monica had gone to the treatment plant to help clean some of these 15-foot tall industrial-sized vats that contained human waste. She had done this enough times that when she was here, she did not need any supervision. And so that morning, she was alone. She climbed up onto one of the catwalks over one of these big vats, and she had reached down with her testing kit to test the sewage to see how much cleaning it would need. And as she did that, she somehow slipped and fell into the big vat of human waste. Now, she would not have immediately gone under. It was not like a liquid. It was more like clay or really thick mud, where at first she would have kind of been laying on top of the sewage. But as soon as she tried to move to get out of the sewage would have functioned more like quicksand, where as soon as a part of her body went under the surface, it would not come up again. And so after the police composed themselves, they climbed up onto the catwalk and they looked down and they saw Monica, who was face down, partially submerged inside of this vat, and she was deceased. Her autopsy would reveal that she died of drowning, which means she literally inhaled human waste. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please sneak in to the Like Button's house in the middle of the night and burn several bags of microwave popcorn. In early January of 1987, a very strange 52-year-old woman named Ruthie Mae McCoy walked out of her 11th floor apartment in Chicago, Illinois. Today was the day that Ruthie was going to be doing one of her self-appointed public duties. Ruthie was quite tall, and this particular day, she had on 2 pairs of pants with a dress over them. She also had her favorite long stick she was carrying. And as Ruthie marched down the hallway, she began jiggling each of her neighbors' doorknobs to see if they were unlocked. And then in between each doorknob check, she would suddenly stop and wave her stick around like it was a sword, and she was fighting off some unseen attacker. And so after Ruthie had checked 4 doors in a row that were all locked, she reached the 5th door, and when she tried the doorknob, it was unlocked. And so without any hesitation, Ruthie pushed the door open, she stepped inside and began yelling, "Hey, look at me, I'm inside of your apartment!" And the woman who lived in this 5th apartment was in her kitchen making dinner at the time, and when she looked up and saw Ruthie barging into her apartment, she wasn't scared. She was just totally annoyed. She rolled her eyes and then began yelling at Ruthie to get out now. But, as always, Ruthie didn't listen. And before long, Ruthie had moved from the doorframe into the apartment, into the kitchen, where she was waving her stick around wildly and berating this young woman for leaving her front door unlocked in this very dangerous apartment building. The young woman yelled at Ruthie a few more times to try to get her to just leave, but Ruthie didn't budge, and so eventually this young woman picked up the phone and called 911. It would turn out the 15-story apartment building that Ruthie and this young woman and all of their neighbors lived in was indeed a very dangerous place to leave your front door unlocked. In fact, at the time in the late 1980s, this particular apartment building was considered to be one of the most dangerous places in all of Chicago, with a murder occurring there nearly every week. Gangs basically ruled the building, which was totally falling apart and totally decrepit and had these long dark hallways that thieves and killers could hide in. And so Ruthie wasn't wrong in trying to get her neighbors to keep their doors locked, but her very hands-on approach to delivering this message was never met with appreciation from the people who lived on her floor. Instead, her neighbors viewed Ruthie as potentially more hazardous than anything Ruthie was trying to protect them from. However, in reality, Ruthie was not a threat to her neighbors. She was just totally mentally unstable and basically afraid of everything. For example, whenever Ruthie got mail, she would just assume that it was terrible news and most likely about someone coming to take all of her money. And when Ruthie was out in public, which was quite rare, she was so scared of strangers that whenever she passed them, she would just yell out obscenities at them to keep them away. And then also when Ruthie was in public, she never ate because she was afraid strangers were going to literally run up and take her food. So, back inside of this 5th apartment that Ruthie has barged into, Ruthie was busy berating this young woman about her unlocked door when the police did finally show up and they dragged Ruthie out of the apartment into the hall. The police by this point knew Ruthie really, really well, and they were not about to arrest her. They knew she was harmless, but just kind of out of her mind. And so, like they always did in this situation, they told Ruthie to leave her neighbors alone and just go back into your apartment and mind your own business. And Ruthie usually would mutter something under her breath about needing to increase the security in this building, but she would eventually do as she was told and she would go back home. And that was basically Ruthie's life in a nutshell. Constant fear and paranoia from living in this totally dangerous apartment building, exacerbated tenfold by her very poor mental health. But Ruthie was not content with her life. She, like virtually everybody else in this high-rise apartment building, wanted to get out and live somewhere else and have a better life. But Ruthie, like virtually everybody else living in this high-rise apartment building, did not have enough money, and so she was trapped there. But then, in February of 1987, so 1 month after busting into that woman's apartment, Ruthie got incredible news. She had recently begun going to a day program for psychiatric care at a local hospital, and the staff there had really taken a liking to her, and they were going above and beyond trying to help Ruthie kind of get her life together beyond just her mental health. And so one of the things they were doing with her was helping her apply for various government programs like disability payments. And so that month, in February, Ruthie found out that the application they had sent off for her was approved, and so Ruthie was entitled to disability payments, which meant right away she would get a check for $2,000, and then every month going forward indefinitely she would get a payment. It wouldn't be $2,000, but it would be a lot of money. Ruthie was beside herself. She could not believe her luck. And she now knew that with this money, she would finally be able to move out of that terrible apartment. Even before the money began coming into Ruthie, she was already looking for a new place to live. And as she did this, all she could think about were her 2 beloved grandchildren, a little boy and a little girl. They were the only people in the world, it seemed, to Ruthie that really accepted her and just loved her unconditionally. And so whenever Ruthie would go visit her grandkids, the 3 of them would sit on the ground and just play together for hours and hours. But to that point, Ruthie's grandkids had not been allowed to visit Ruthie at her apartment because it was too dangerous. But now that Ruthie was going to move into someplace much, much safer, she knew that was going to change. She was going to see her grandkids so much more often. And this made Ruthie so happy. And this newfound happiness inside of Ruthie really motivated her to start looking at other aspects of her life and see if she could improve them. And so, as Ruthie is doing this new apartment search, she began taking classes to finally get her high school degree. She began picking up these old art projects she had kind of blown off. And also, most importantly to this story, she really began leaning into her religion, something she had not been doing for a long time. Specifically, she began tuning in to these very animated preachers that she would find on TV. And when she really liked one of them, she would write them a letter, and in this letter, she would praise them for their sermons and how incredible they were, and she would ask them to bless her with miracles. And these miracles were often just centered on her health. She wanted to look and feel young again. And some of these TV preachers, who were actually just running scams, would write back to Ruthie and say, "Of course we can bless you with your miracles, but first, send us some money." And so, when Ruthie's disability payments began coming in, even though she needed to save every penny to be able to afford moving out to start this beautiful new life with her grandkids, she still found a way to set aside some of that money and sent it off to these TV preachers. And soon, these preachers were sending things back to Ruthie. Things like a blessed piece of wood for her to sleep on, or bottles of water said to be from the holy river Jordan. These spiritual items were often accompanied with a letter from these preachers telling Ruthie that in order for them to fulfill her miracles request, she would need to keep these spiritual items close to her and also send us some more money. And so Ruthie did as she was told, and after sending off all this money, she would excitedly wait inside of her apartment for her miracles to come true. And while she waited, she began tacking up all these newspaper articles all over her apartment of these people who miracles had happened to them, that supposedly God had fixed their teeth or eradicated a tumor in their brain or cured them of cancer. And in all of these stories, the person who the miracle happened to would describe looking in the mirror one day and just looking different. And that was the moment they knew that this miracle had occurred. And so Ruthie, believing this was bound to happen to her any day because she was working with these TV preachers, began going to her bathroom mirror all the time and just looking at herself, looking for some visible change in her appearance that would indicate one of her miracles had come true. But by April 22nd, so roughly a month after finding out she was going to be receiving these payments, and this was about 2 weeks before she was set to actually move out into her new place, Ruthie had still not seen any sign in the mirror that she had changed, and so she believed these miracles had not happened yet. But something else had begun happening when Ruthie was in the bathroom looking at herself in the mirror. And that was, she would hear somewhere off in the distance the sound of someone talking to her. It was almost like they were whispering to her, but she couldn't quite tell what they were saying. Now, Ruthie wanted to believe that these disembodied voices had something to do with her miracles coming to fruition, but Ruthie was naturally a very paranoid and scared person, and so she couldn't help but be a little bit scared of these voices. And so that afternoon, when Ruthie was on the bus headed back home after a doctor's appointment, she told a friend on the bus about these strange whispers she was hearing, and Ruthie would also say that she felt like these whispers meant that somebody was out to get her. Now, Ruthie's friend knew Ruthie really well, and this just wasn't unusual behavior for Ruthie. Ruthie routinely thought people were out to get her, and she talked about hearing voices before in the past. And so this friend told Ruthie that, you really should tell someone about this. But deep down, this friend was not that concerned. This was kind of normal Ruthie behavior, and this couldn't be a big deal. However, it would turn out to be a huge deal. That night, around 8:45 p.m., when Ruthie was back home at her apartment, she called 911. And when the dispatcher answered her call, Ruthie was in a total panic, and she was talking about something to do with the cabinets and with her bathroom and how her neighbors wanted to use her bathroom. And the dispatcher just did not understand. And they tried to ask Ruthie some clarifying questions, but Ruthie just could not put together a coherent sentence. And so the dispatcher told Ruthie that they would send police over right away. And then afterwards, the dispatcher would put out to the officers in the area that, hey, Ruthie McCoy seems to be having some sort of argument with her neighbors over cabinets. I don't really know, but someone needs to go check it out. And when the officers got that call, they were not quick to respond. They knew Ruthie. They knew that this was likely nonsense. But 15 minutes after Ruthie called 911, 911 got another call from somebody else inside of Ruthie's apartment building, and they were calling to report hearing loud noises coming from inside of Ruthie's apartment. And so at this, the police did act quickly. They rushed over to the apartment building. They went to the 11th floor. They went to Ruthie's door, and they began pounding on her door because it was locked. But Ruthie didn't come to the door, and it was totally silent inside of her apartment. And so at some point, the police called back to dispatch and asked them to call Ruthie on the phone she had just used 15 minutes earlier to call 911. And so these police officers are standing right outside of Ruthie's door, and they're listening to the sound of Ruthie's phone ringing inside of her house, But Ruthie didn't answer it, and again, the apartment stayed totally quiet. And so the responding officers turned around and began walking down the hall and knocking on other people's doors and began asking them, hey, did you hear any loud sounds coming out of Ruthie's apartment? And everybody said no. And so the police eventually just kind of gave up and left, despite not seeing Ruthie, not talking to Ruthie, not seeing what's going on inside of her apartment. The next day, when one of Ruthie's friends on her floor noticed that Ruthie had not come out of her apartment all day, and when she knocked on the door, Ruthie didn't answer, this friend called the police. The police came out again, they knocked on Ruthie's door, and after a while, when she didn't answer, the police again just left. Ruthie's friend, who had called the police, was furious that the police were not taking this seriously, and so she wound up contacting maintenance of the building, and a janitor went up to the 11th floor, went to Ruthie's door, drilled through the lock, and pushed her door open. The janitor immediately yelled out for Ruthie, but there was no response, and so he stepped inside and kind of looked around, and right away he was struck by two things. One, it was a total mess inside of her apartment. There were all these religious books and pamphlets all over the ground, but as messy as the apartment looked, it also seemed weirdly empty. Like there was no TV, there was really no furniture or anywhere to sit. It was almost like this apartment had been half moved out, and then whoever was moving it out had just kind of stopped. The janitor started to get a really bad feeling about being inside of this apartment, but he mustered the courage to walk a little farther into the apartment to look into the bedroom. And when he turned the corner and looked into that bedroom, he froze, because there on the ground was Ruthie McCoy. She was lying on the ground in a pool of her own blood. She was dead. The police were called, they came out, they walked around her apartment, and they concluded that this was kind of an open and shut case. Ruthie must have opened her door for the wrong person who came inside and killed her. Remember, this apartment building saw one murder nearly every week, so this really was kind of routine. And just a couple of days later, the police would arrest a 19-year-old living in this apartment building named Edward Turner because he was found to be in possession of Ruthie's TV. Edward did not admit to doing anything, but the police assumed that, he must have tried to rob Ruthie, and in the course of this robbery, perhaps Ruthie had tried to fight back, at which point Edward had overpowered her and killed her. But the police did suspect that there was at least one other person involved in Ruthie's murder, so they did keep investigating. And then in June, so about a month and a half after Edward was arrested, the police began hearing this very disturbing rumor about the building where Ruthie had lived. At first, the police completely dismissed it because it sounded totally made up. But when it kept coming up over and over again, whenever they interviewed anybody in this building about Ruthie's murder, the police finally decided they had to at least look into it in order to confirm that it was not true. However, when the police looked into this rumor, they would discover that it was true, and it absolutely played a role in Ruthie's murder. Back on the night of April 22nd, 1987, so the night that Ruthie called 911 in a panic, saying something about her cabinets and her neighbors and her bathroom, well, what had really happened is Ruth was home around 8:45 when she heard this loud banging sound coming from her bathroom. And then before she could go over and inspect the bathroom, her bathroom door flung open, and standing in the doorway was this dark, tall figure who just suddenly took off running through her apartment, out her front door, out into the hallway. Ruthie was so startled she had no idea what to make of it. She knew that sometimes she saw things that weren't real, and so she likely struggled to figure out, did that really happen? Am I dreaming? Am I hallucinating? What's going on? And so with all these thoughts going through her head, she called 911 to get help, but she couldn't quite describe what had even happened. And so that's why she began rambling about how her neighbors wanted to use her bathroom and the cabinets were somehow involved. It was all very confusing. And so the dispatcher obviously didn't understand what was going on, but they told Ruthie, okay, I'll pass this along and the police will be out soon. And so as Ruthie is waiting for the police to show up, she wanders over to the bathroom where this dark figure has appeared, and she walks inside and she looks at where her mirror had been above her sink. The mirror that she had spent so many hours looking into, hoping for signs of a miracle, and the mirror was gone. And in its place was this big dark hole on the wall, almost like an entrance to a dark tunnel. And as Ruthie is staring at this void, she sees these two dark hands emerge from underneath that come out of the hole and grip onto her sink. And then eyes pop up and a man's head pops up, and then he uses his arms, which are clutched onto the sink, to pull himself up and out of the hole in her wall, where he plopped down on the bathroom floor and then stood up and stared at Ruthie. And then everything after that point would have happened really fast. Ruthie likely began screaming, at which point the first man, the dark figure that had run out into the hallway and prompted Ruthie to call 911, he must have heard Ruthie screaming, and so he came running back in through the front door into Ruthie's apartment with a jacket over his head, and then at some point he or the other man who had come out of the hole in the wall yelled at Ruthie to get down on the ground. Maybe she didn't comply, maybe she did, but after that, 4 gunshots rang out. All 4 shots hit Ruthie. However, these 4 shots did not kill Ruthie right away. And so Ruthie was very alive as these 2 men stole her TV, they stole her rocking chair and some other things, and Ruthie was almost certainly still alive when the police did finally show up and began knocking on her door and calling her phone, but she was bleeding to death. She couldn't move, she couldn't make a sound, but the police just abandoned her, at which point she did die. It would turn out that disturbing rumor that the police heard about this apartment building was that apparently people in this building had learned that you could pull off your mirror inside of your bathroom and literally climb into the walls. And from that point, you could basically wander all over this building and then punch other people's mirrors in their bathrooms in, and then climb through that hole and do whatever you wanted to the people inside of that apartment. And so when Ruthie began hearing those whispers when she was in her bathroom looking at the mirror hoping for a miracle, those were the sounds of thieves and killers and criminals slinking about her wall. Detectives speculated that the 2 men who killed Ruthie likely found out about her disability payments and decided to rob her. However, the 2 men that police arrested, the 19-year-old Edward Turner, who was found in possession of her TV, and this other man who was also arrested, were ultimately acquitted because there were so many people crawling through the walls all day and night inside of this building that there was no way to prove that those 2 were the ones who actually went in and killed Ruthie. To this day, no one else has ever been charged with Ruthie's murder. What happened to Ruthie became the basis for the very popular horror movie called The Candyman, starring Tony Todd. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please sneak into the like button's house, toast all of their bread, and then leave. At 4 a.m. on February 25th, 2022, a 36-year-old father of 3 named Christopher Boudram woke up inside of his modest home in Pointe-à-Pierre, which is a city on the Caribbean island of Trinidad and Tobago. After quietly getting out of his bed so as not to wake up his wife, who was still asleep, Christopher walked into the other room and did his typical morning exercise routine, and then afterward, he made himself some breakfast in the kitchen, and by 5:30 a.m., he was out his front door, into his car, making the commute to work. Christopher was a professional scuba diver, and he had been for over 10 years. Commercial diving is a very broad field to work in, but generally it meant that Christopher was paid to do various tasks underwater, things like inspections or welding or just moving equipment around. For the last 8 months, Christopher had been fortunate enough to be working for a company that was located just 2 minutes drive from his house. It was an oil and gas company called Perea Fuel. And Christopher's duties at Perea Fuel centered primarily on the upkeep and maintenance of several of these underwater pipelines that Perea Fuel used to get the oil off of their ships and onto land where it could be processed. These underwater pipelines, of which Perea had at least 6, were basically U-shaped. They had these 2 vertical sections on either end that would jut out of the water. And then connecting these 2 vertical sections was a 1,200-foot long section of pipe that ran along the seabed at roughly 60 feet below the surface. And so one of these vertical sections was out at sea, so 1,200 feet off the coast, and ships would literally come by this opening to the pipe that was out of the water, and they would dump their oil into this opening. The oil would go down, it would shoot across this long horizontal section, and then go up the other vertical section much closer to shore, where workers could collect the oil and bring it onto land to be processed. So on this particular day in February of 2022, when Christopher arrived at Perea Fuel, he was not surprised at all to find out that he and his diving colleagues would be doing some maintenance on one of these underwater pipelines. However, there was something unique about the particular pipeline they'd be working on. It was called berth number 6, and unlike the rest of Perea Fuel's underwater oil transport pipelines, this one had not been active since 2018. So for the past 4 years, it had just sat idle. Now, this was on purpose. For whatever reason, the company had decided not to use berth number 6, and so they put it into a sort of storage mode, where the vertical section of berth number 6 that was out at sea was untouched. It was still just poking out of the water, no changes. However, the other vertical section of berth number 6 that was closest to shore was first plugged up, like imagine putting a cork inside of a wine bottle. That's basically what they did to this vertical section, except they used this huge inflatable cork. Imagine like a huge pool toy. They basically jammed it inside of the vertical section, and then they inflated it so much that it was completely airtight inside of this pipe. And then, once it was all plugged up, they submerged this section of the vertical pipe underwater, maybe 5 or 10 feet below the surface, to kind of keep it out of the way of all the ships that would be moving around close to shore. And then also what they did is they put something called a habitat on top of the opening of this now submerged vertical section of berth number 6. To understand it, you got to picture something else, okay? So imagine you're in the bathtub and you have a bucket, and you flip it upside down above the surface, so there's nothing inside of the bucket, and you just take the bucket and push it straight down into the water. No matter how deep you push that bucket, as long as you don't rotate it to one side or the other and you just keep it steady, that air pocket inside of the bucket will remain. You can literally reach your hand under the bucket underwater and it will be dry. And so basically that's what this habitat was. Perea Fuel took a huge bucket, if you will, and they lowered it straight into the water and pressed it down and anchored it right above the opening to this submerged vertical section. So there was a permanent air pocket over the opening to this pipe. And the reason for this is because if they needed to do work on this pipe, like for example, today they wanted Christopher and his colleagues to make this pipe active again, which meant doing work on it, the divers could swim down, get inside of this habitat, stand on the little metal platform they put in there, and then they could take off all of their cumbersome diving equipment and just work on the pipe while breathing air. It was really kind of a luxury. And so after Christopher and the 4 other divers he'd be with that day got their instructions, to get berth number 6 active again, they began getting all their gear together and going over who would be responsible for what once they got down to the habitat. And then once they were all ready, they made their way out to the boat. The 4 other divers that Christopher would be working with that day were men he had worked with many times before and men he would consider his friends. Their names were Kazim Ali Jr., Yusuf Henry, Faisal Kurban, and Rishi Nagasar. Once their boat had moved just off the coast and had stopped kind of roughly over the area where below the surface was this submerged berth number 6 vertical pipe and the habitat, the divers hopped off the boat and they swam straight down. They went up and under the side of this habitat wall and they entered into this breathable airspace right around the entrance to this pipe. And so they climbed up onto the platform, they took off all of their gear, and then once they were just in their wetsuits, they got to work. Now, the job was relatively straightforward. They just needed to basically pull a lever inside of the pipe that would then deflate the big inflatable plug that had been set inside of this pipe to seal it. However, when one of the divers reached down and began to pull on the lever, it was jammed. And so they needed a wrench to kind of free the lever. And so Kazim volunteered to go back to the surface and get a wrench because no one had one inside of the habitat. And so Kazim put his dive gear back on. He dove out from underneath this habitat, swam back to the surface. He talked to the folks on the boat. They handed him a wrench, and then he swam right back down, back inside of the habitat. And then once he poked himself back up, he handed the wrench up to the nearest diver. And that diver took the wrench, he turned back around to face the pipe, he reached down inside, and he began fiddling with the lever, and eventually he freed it. However, the second this lever was activated, something horrific happened inside of that space. We don't know exactly how this happened or what exactly could have been done to prevent it, but in short, the second that lever was activated, it began to deflate this big cork that had been plugging up this inactive pipeline for the past 4 years. And when that happened, it broke the seal, and suddenly all this low pressure air that was sitting in 1,200 feet of pipeline made contact with the extremely high pressure air that was inside of this habitat. And air likes to go from high pressure to low pressure. And so the second that seal was broken, the high pressure air in the habitat expanded down into the pipe. But this happened so quickly. It was almost instantaneous. It was almost like the pipe opening became the world's strongest vacuum, and it sucked everything inside of the habitat, all the air, all the equipment, all 5 men into the pipe, and it also began sucking in seawater. Basically everything was going in this pipe. And so these 5 men, they don't have their scuba gear on, went from just standing outside the pipe to feet first flying into this pipe with all of their heavy equipment all around them, and there's seawater all over them. They're holding their breath, and so they get sucked down the vertical section, they turn the corner, and they get rocketed out to sea. They are on the 1,200 foot long section, the horizontal section, just blazing a trail. Now think about this. All 5 of these guys have no idea what's happened. They're on a breath hold. They are shooting down a pipe. They can't see anything. The space inside of this pipe is so narrow. It's 2.5 feet across. And so they're getting compressed. Their shoulders can barely fit inside of this pipe. And so you gotta figure that all of them are expecting to die. But eventually the pressure in this pipe did equalize, at which point this vacuum phenomenon stopped up at the habitat, and actually the habitat kind of refilled with air. And when that happened, all the seawater that was getting pulled into this pipe also stopped. So no more air, no more seawater is going into this pipe. It's kind of like whatever went into the pipe, that's what's down there. And when this equalization happened, these men, who by this point are on a several minute long breath hold, they eventually begin to slow down and come to a stop. And by some miracle, they came to stop in a section of this horizontal pipe that was not totally flat to the seabed. It was slightly elevated, which meant there was a small air pocket where they stopped. And so they come to a stop and they just start gasping for air, and then they begin yelling out to each other, and they realize all 5 of them are alive, and they're all kind of roughly grouped together in this air pocket. And we know this because one of their cameras on their bodies was rolling when they were pulled into the pipe. And so we can't see anything because it's pitch black inside of this pipe, but we can hear them talking to each other once everything stops. And so over the course of this kind of chaotic initial volley of communication up and down the pipe, where again, these guys are on their backs, they can't move at all. They're completely kind of trapped in position. And even though they're in an air pocket, there is water kind of close to their face. And so they have this little area to breathe in. They're panicking, they're screaming at each other. But in this volley, they're able to figure out that Christopher was the closest to the way they had come into the pipe, meaning his head was closest to the vertical section closest to shore, and all 4 other men were right below him. And so Christopher knew if they were going to get out, their best chance was to backtrack, head towards the way they came in, which meant Christopher would have to lead them. And so Christopher kind of found it within himself. Again, we can hear him on audio, and he told the others to calm down and link their feet onto the person below them's shoulders. And so to do that, the only way these guys could move in this tight little pipe is just by pushing with their heels. And so painfully, slowly, these guys who were very badly battered at this point, I mean, they came flying in here surrounded by all their heavy equipment crashing into them. Guys had broken bones. They were really badly beat up, but they finally make their way until they're all linked, feet under each other's shoulders. And then Christopher, in the lead, began kind of going in reverse, inching their way up the pipe back towards the way they came in. Now, the reason they felt strongly that they needed to act right away and not wait for rescue is because they didn't really understand how this had even happened. They didn't know if at any moment more water was going to pour into this pipe. They also understood that there was limited air, and at some point they would suffocate. And so with that in mind, they begin this journey. And right away, Christopher reaches the first flooded section of the pipe. Now, you have to understand, they have no idea how long this flooded section of pipe is. And so once you start moving into this flooded section behind you, once you go underwater, you're either going to find another air pocket at some point, or you're going to drown. And so it would turn out that only Christopher and the guy right below him, Faisal, were willing and physically able to attempt this potential suicide mission. And so the others, they began panicking. The others who were not going to go, and they're screaming out for Christopher and Faisal not to leave them. You can hear it on audio. But Christopher and Faisal, they felt strongly that somebody has to go to the surface and get help. And so Christopher and Faisal, linked together, begin inching into this flooded section of pipe. Pitch black. They have no idea what's going to happen. They're slowly going under the water, and they just begin inching their way on a breath hold. And by some miracle, this first flooded section they entered into was not very long. And so both Christopher and Faisal were able to barely, coughing and gagging, get out the other side into yet another air pocket. And by an even bigger miracle, in that new air pocket, Christopher, above him, he managed to get one hand above his head. He felt scuba tanks, 2 of them. And he was able to take one of them and somehow force it past the side of his body down to Faisal. And so both men suddenly had an air tank. Now they had to kind of awkwardly pin the tank above their head. These tanks are not light. If you've not scuba dived, it's like pushing a pretty heavy weight. And they had the regulator, so the mouthpiece that actually gives you the air in their mouths, but they couldn't really hold the mouthpiece in place. It was this very awkward thing they were going to do, but this meant they could now enter much longer flooded sections of pipe and potentially make it out the other side. And so with their air tanks on top of their heads and their mouthpieces in their mouth, gripping down as hard as they can with their teeth, they continued to inch along with their heels, and they entered into more and more of these flooded sections of pipe. As they're doing this, they know they have a scuba tank, but they have no idea how much air is in these tanks. They can't see the gauge. And so it's kind of the same thing as going in on a breath hold. You don't know when you're going to run out of air because you don't know how long these flooded sections are. So you can only imagine how terrifying this must have been. But they kept on going, and finally, after hours of this, that Christopher and Faisal are going through these terrifying stretches of, hoping they can hold on to that mouthpiece and hoping they got enough air. They get through these flooded sections, hit the next air pocket. After hours of doing that, they reach this air pocket where Faisal starts to kind of lose it. And he starts yelling to Christopher in the total dark to stop, but he didn't have a reason, and Christopher could kind of sense that, Faisal's starting to lose it and we're running out of time here. And Christopher, he can hear the other divers that they had left behind in the beginning screaming out all the way back down the pipe. And so Christopher, he stayed composed and he tried to get Faisal to calm down and come with him. But when it was clear he wasn't going to, he told Faisal that, hey, I'm going to keep going alone then. I'm going to get us help and I'll be back for you. And so Faisal, he was still panicking and he yelled at Christopher not to go any further. But Christopher knew he had to go. And so with the sound of his friends screaming out for him to stop, Christopher again cinched down with his teeth on the mouthpiece, continued to push this air tank above his head, and he inched his way closer and closer to the entrance of this pipe. And after reaching a very long underwater section where he knows he's running out of air, his tank hit the kink in the pipe where it went vertical again, which meant right above him was the exit. The habitat is right up there. And so Christopher was able to kind of turn and swim up this vertical section until he popped up. And it was again another air pocket, except the water level in this vertical section was not close enough to the exit of the pipe to actually pull himself out. It was like Christopher was stuck at the bottom of a well, like there's nothing he can do. But luckily there was a chain that was dangling down in arm's reach. And so Christopher grabbed the chain and just had to wait, having no idea if anybody was coming to get them. But eventually 2 rescue divers did get into the habitat, and they reached down and they pulled Christopher out of the pipe and they saved him. And when they brought him up to the surface, Christopher saw that Paria Fuel had their emergency response team on site. The Trinidad and Tobago Coast Guard was there, and it's clear they're getting ready to do some sort of rescue operation. And so Christopher, who's totally traumatized, he's badly hurt, he still ran up to authorities and told them, all 4 of my colleagues are still alive. I heard them banging in the pipes. I know they're in air pockets. You gotta go back down. You gotta save them. But ultimately, the authorities decided it was not safe to send rescuers down into this pipe. And so when Christopher found out they were not going to try to rescue his friends who are literally banging the pipe, he can hear them, he tried to jump back in the water to do it himself. And they stopped him. And then Christopher was rushed to the hospital where once he was admitted to the intensive care unit, he tried to check himself out to go back to the water to save his friends. But again, Christopher was stopped. For 2 whole days after Christopher was rescued from this pipe, his colleagues, the 4 other divers, remained trapped in the most claustrophobic, horrible situation imaginable, and they continued to bang on the pipe and make noises that could be heard on the surface, but nobody did anything. And so finally, on February 27th, the noises stopped inside of the pipe, because all of the men died. They either died of suffocation because they ran out of air in the pipe, or they died from one of their injuries, or they attempted to do one of those long underwater sections of pipe on a breath hold because they didn't have scuba tanks, and they drowned. On February 28th, 3 of the divers' bodies were recovered, and the final body, the 4th diver, was recovered on March 3rd. It's unclear why Christopher and the other divers did not do something to equalize the pressure inside of the habitat and inside of this pipe before undoing the plug, because this vacuum effect, which is known as delta P, is actually easy to anticipate and relatively easy to prevent. But the investigation into exactly what happened and who is to blame is still ongoing. However, the only survivor, Christopher, and many other people who are following this case, they believe the 4 deaths are directly attributable to Paria Fuel, who were primarily responsible for not allowing a rescue operation to happen in those first 2 days, where you could clearly hear the sounds of these divers banging on the pipe. And so to finish this story, I'm going to show you the final footage taken by one of the divers, Kazim, who was the one who got the wrench and brought it back inside the habitat, handed it off, and then that wrench was used to push the lever, which created the vacuum. You'll see in this video that it looks like nothing is going on, and Kazim is just inside of this habitat and all the divers are fine, and then it's like his camera just turns black. What's happening there is he was pulled so quickly into the pipe that it looks like it was a cut of the camera, when in reality, that's just how fast everything inside of that habitat was pulled into the pipe. This video is highly distressing. Viewer discretion is advised. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, please encourage the like button to join the official MrBallen Discord server. However, secretly manipulate their account so that no matter how engaged they are on the server, they can't level up.